Passwords, shared drive, now, then clean out your desk. That's what the email said. No subject line, no signature, just that. Sent at 11:43 p.m. on a Friday, while most of the team was off posting vision boards and New Year's resolutions like hydrate more and spend less time online. Meanwhile, I was archiving risk logs, clearing stale tokens, and catching what I knew was a shady data scrape attempt from someone in the VP suite. And now here it was, the full slap. I stared at the screen for a long minute, not angry, not surprised, just precise. I'd seen this pattern before, entitled exec, inflated title, no understanding of back-end infrastructure, but loaded with buzzwords like agile pivot and legacy detachment. They think yelling modernize into a Slack thread gives them admin rights. But this one, Benton, he'd crossed a contract line so deep I almost felt bad for him. Quick break in the story. If you're listening right now and haven't subscribed, this is your sign. Hit that like button too. It tells the team to keep dropping stories like this. We read every comment, every share. You know the drill. Back to it. The shared drive Benton was trying to commandeer, it wasn't even theirs. Hasn't been for 5 years. Barrister Systems LLC, my consultancy, hosted that environment under a custodial license approved by the company's legal team back in 2019. I built it, monitored it, updated it, and under Schedule B of that agreement, the environment remained under my authority unless formally transferred through a board resolution. Not HR, not a VP with Wi-Fi tantrums. The board. So when I saw 3 unauthorized mirror attempts earlier that week, all pinging from his subnet, I'd flagged them. Quietly. Logged them. Sent him a neutral message with the alert chain. No drama, no threat, just protocol. He never replied. I wasn't sure if he didn't read it, didn't understand it, or didn't care, but I knew what came next. And that email, stripped of pleasantries, confirmed it. He thought he could brute force his way in, strip access, cut ties, probably tell the team I failed to deliver. He didn't know he'd just voided a live SLA. I didn't panic. I didn't argue. I opened the contract folder, pulled up the service agreement, clipped clause 7.4b, and replied to his email, formally, CCing legal. There is no password to provide. The environment is under active custodial license through Barrister Systems LLC per the framework agreement signed AO3 19 2019. Termination must be initiated via board resolution. I await legal's instruction. I hit send, then logged into the secure node and triggered a lock protocol I'd written after a similar debacle 3 years ago at a different client. One who, by the way, had to pay triple just to get a 60% restore. Benton had no idea what he'd unleashed. At 12:07 a.m., I received a notice from the legal team replying all. Please clarify, has Benton issued an official termination of the vendor relationship with Barrister Systems LLC? 5 minutes later, Benton forwarded my email to legal with 2 words, please handle. No context, no comprehension, just a digital shrug. And that was all it took. The clause was self-triggering. If the company initiated a termination without prior board resolution and 30-day notice, the entire vendor-hosted infrastructure was legally required to deactivate within 60 minutes. Snapshots freeze, access logs archive, credentials void, back-end syncs stop mid-ping. 12:19 a.m., my scripts activated. A soft hum in my apartment as my backup server blinked alive, recording every data touch, every failed access attempt. 12:23 a.m., the main dashboard, used by ops, finance, marketing, compliance, went into custody mode. White background, black letters, company seal, 1 line. This environment is currently under vendor lockout per clause 7.4b, Barrister Systems LLC. I sat back in my chair and watched the logs populate. No yelling. No pettiness, just clean protocol. 12 hours from now, half the company would wake up to blank dashboards and 404 errors. And Benton Sorrell? He'd wake up thinking he'd won. But the contract was louder than his authority, and it was already speaking. There's a moment, just one, you get in corporate war zones like this. A moment where you realize the person on the other side of the screen thinks they're playing checkers when the board is built for chess. Benton hit me with his little all-caps tantrum. Passwords, shared drive, now, then clean out your desk. like he was ordering lunch and I was supposed to nod along and hand over the keys to a kingdom he didn't even understand. No HR, no termination protocol, no exit interview, just brute force arrogance in text form. I stared at it long enough to finish my tea. He genuinely thought I was a glorified IT girl who forgot to retire when the CIO changed. Someone who'd hand over access and cry into a Google Doc about betrayal. But see, I don't do betrayal. I do documentation, and I documented everything. When we signed the Service Framework Agreement in 2019, it was Benton's predecessor who negotiated the terms. They didn't want to pay in-house for long-term infrastructure development, so they outsourced to me, Barrister Systems LLC, with full custodial rights. It was written plain as day. The environment, hosting rights, and access credentials were vendor-governed until formally reassigned by a board resolution. Not a Slack ping, not a VP tantrum. The board. It wasn't even a buried clause. It was right there in Schedule B. I opened the original contract folder, found the signed PDF, and attached it to my reply. Then, with all the cold calm of a surgeon before the first incision, I typed, per Section 4.3 and Schedule B of the Service Framework Agreement, the environment in question remains under Barrister Systems LLC custody. There is no credential to provide. Please coordinate with your legal department. I copied legal just to make it official, then hit send. And that was it. The point of no return. Benton didn't respond directly. Of course not. People like him don't handle direct contradiction well. They flinch, they forward, they escalate, which is exactly what he did. 10 minutes later, I got CC'd on a chain where he dumped my reply onto legal's desk with nothing but, please handle. No explanation, no context, just assumed authority. That's where things went sideways. Legal didn't respond to me, they went straight to the CEO. I only found out because someone in the loop, an old colleague from compliance who'd seen this kind of fire drill before, forwarded me the internal message the next morning. You've just triggered a termination of vendor services without required board procedure. Clause 7.4b is in effect. Simple, cold, atomic. The clause they were referring to, it meant every service Barrister Systems handled, including cloud syncs, shared documentation, automation bridges, and access tokens, was contractually obligated to deactivate immediately upon improper termination, not in 30 days, not after a handoff. Immediately, because this wasn't a job. This was a licensed custodial environment, and they'd just invalidated the license. By the time I finished my second cup of coffee, my end of the pipeline was already logging autolocks. The scripts I'd written years ago, fail-safes in case of legal ambiguity, were crawling through the environment, freezing access, flagging unauthorized attempts, creating immutable snapshots with blockchain-verified timestamps. I didn't touch anything manually. That would have been a breach. I just watched the system do what it was built to do. Meanwhile, Benton was probably out buying a $7 smoothie and calling himself a visionary. I knew what Monday was going to look like. Panic, blank dashboards, people screaming at IT, wondering where the roadmaps went. Benton trying to spin it like I'd gone rogue. But that's the difference between sabotage and structure. Sabotage is messy. Structure has receipts. And I had every single one of them. Benton never followed up, not with me, not with legal, not even with a half-assed, let's schedule time to align. Just dumped my reply into a thread like a dirty dish and waddled off, trusting someone else would scrub it clean. Subject line, please handle. That was it. 2 words that might as well have read, I have no clue what I'm doing, please bail me out. But here's the thing, legal didn't wash it. They detonated it. 10 minutes later, I got blind copied on a message from the general counsel to the CEO. No preamble, no hand-holding. Just one very cold, very precise sentence. You just terminated your infrastructure vendor. I didn't need to read anything else. Clause 7.4b had gone live. That's the clause I wrote into the original agreement after watching another company try to offload their vendor with a hallway conversation and a follow-up sticky note. It was designed for situations exactly like this, where some executive, drunk on LinkedIn leadership quotes, makes a move without reading the contract that governs their entire operational spine. That clause wasn't symbolic. It was self-triggering. By forwarding my message, without proper review, without board resolution, without transition clearance, Benton had legally terminated Barrister Systems LLC as their active service provider. And per that same clause, that termination voided every SLA tied to me, which meant one thing. Every back-end process, every automation bridge, every API key, every scheduled sync, every inherited credential, every single thing I managed was now dark. And all of it, legal. I didn't celebrate. I didn't send a gloating message. I just acted. I logged out of the active terminal. I exported the session logs. I pulled the audit trail for the last 72 hours, encrypted it, and uploaded it to my offline drive. Then I shut off the pipeline. No fireworks, no drama, just keystrokes. In under 3 minutes, the heartbeat of their backend went from steady green to dead flat. The kicker? Everything I deactivated followed protocol. No traps, no deletions, just silence. Like flipping off the lights before locking the front door. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged, but nothing accessible either. Not unless the board reversed the termination with a quorum vote and a reinstated license. I'd built it that way on purpose, and the system, it documented every second of it. Each sync attempt from that point forward was intercepted by a server I controlled. Every failed login attempt, every batch query that returned null, time-stamped, watermarked and recorded under a read-only archive labeled Barrister Systems LLC, custodial copy. That watermark wasn't cosmetic. It was contractual. It was the digital equivalent of a do not enter sign, written in dry ink signatures and legal teeth. By sunrise, 18 automated reports failed. The AI compliance bot stopped responding. The Q1 model simulations crashed mid-load, and none of them knew why yet, but they would. Because Benton hadn't just broken protocol, he'd broken the contract that ran their entire operational skeleton. And I had no obligation, zero, to help clean it up. It started before sunrise. Those first few confused pings on Slack from team leads in different time zones, tagging the wrong channels, like maybe someone else would make it not true. The dashboards were blank, not loading slow, not error 504, just gone. 8:06 a.m. Eastern Jira board said, missing source object. 8:09, Ops team couldn't find the roadmap doc for Sprint 1. By 8:30, Finance had red flags in 3 forecasting models. They were all built on templates stored in the environment, version-controlled, time-locked, and scheduled for Monday morning simulation. But the link chains were broken. No backups, no validation. Marketing was the loudest. They'd queued their entire January campaign library inside a planning portal nested in the same framework. I know because I helped build it. 5 years of historical click data, funnel results, asset folders, all referenced via shared drive architecture they never once questioned. It was like someone had pulled the oxygen out of the building and they couldn't figure out why they were gasping. AT got pulled into the chaos by 9:15. They had no access either. One of the junior engineers opened a console and hit a dead endpoint loop that sent back one solitary string. Environment unavailable. Custodial hold active. Refer to vendor license. They didn't know what to do with that. By 10:20, I was being pinged directly. Not just by IT, by finance, product, even HR. Hey, weird glitch on the drive? Can you push a hotfix for the dashboard? Hey, can you just let us access last week's copies real quick? I didn't reply to any of them, because I wasn't under contract. My custodial license was revoked Friday night, without proper procedure, without compliance review, and without transition protections. I was no longer the vendor. I had no legal right to give them anything, even if I wanted to, and I didn't want to. Around noon, I muted all notifications and poured myself coffee. I watched from a distance as screenshots started floating into Slack threads. People asking questions that made it obvious none of them had been looped in on the termination. One in particular caught my eye. A blurry image of the shared drive folder tree now replaced with a single message. Barrister custody mode active. Access restricted by clause 7.4b. Captioned, does anyone know WTF this is? Why is it on our drive? No one had an answer. The VP, Benton, was suspiciously silent all day. From what I heard later, he tried to blame the whole thing on vendor non-cooperation. Said I went rogue, sabotaged the handoff. But there was no handoff. There was no transition plan. There was just a one-line email and a Friday night forwarding decision that invalidated the backbone of their entire system. And now, one by one, the teams were realizing their tools weren't broken. They were unavailable, not because of a bug, but because they no longer owned the infrastructure they depended on. By end of day, nobody knew where the core docs had gone. Some assumed it was ransomware. Others blamed AWS. One person suggested maybe we'd been hacked by a disgruntled ex-employee. I guess technically, they weren't wrong. Tuesday morning, the entire exec suite tried to pretend the building wasn't on fire. There was an emergency sync scheduled for 8:00 a.m. sharp, mandatory attendance for all department leads. You could feel the panic under the surface, like everyone knew something was very, very wrong, but didn't want to be the first to admit they couldn't fix it. Benton opened the call like nothing had happened. "I want to address the vendor situation," he said, calm as a man about to walk off a cliff. "We're experiencing temporary access disruptions due to a failure in the transition process. Our prior contractor, Barrister Systems, refused to cooperate with the scheduled handoff. We're resolving it internally." Refused to cooperate? That's what he went with? He looked directly into the camera like he was auditioning for a crisis PR gig, as if saying it calmly enough would rewrite the chain of emails with legal, nullify a binding framework agreement, and override the blinking red dashboard still showing environment unavailable across half the company. And then, halfway through his spin job, the general counsel unmuted. "Benton," she said, voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "you violated Clause 7.4b. You can't revoke a vendor's data environment without a board vote and custodial transfer protocol. The environment is proprietary." The call went dead silent. Even the background coughs stopped. She clicked something on her screen, and my final invoice loaded into the shared meeting tab. Big, centered, and impossible to miss. The top header in bold, "Final invoice. Termination triggered per clause 7.4b. Support ceased due to unauthorized directive dated Friday, 11:43 p.m. Underneath it, clear as day, my system's audit trail summary. Hundreds of document access attempts from internal accounts after the contract was voided. Each one tagged, each one time-stamped, each one silently logged and auto-forwarded to legal with breach notifications embedded. One of the department heads squinted and leaned closer to their camera. Wait, so every time we tried to pull from the drive..." "Yes," legal confirmed. "It triggered a breach flag, real time. Vendor was within their rights to lock, log, and report." Someone else whispered, "Jesus Christ." Marketing asked if they'd still be able to recover the campaign data. Legal didn't answer. They just looked tired, like they'd warned someone more than once and were now just letting the pain unfold in real time. Benton started backpedaling. "I thought we had authority under internal system transition protocol." "You didn't," legal interrupted again. "Barrister Systems is not internal. You executed an external vendor termination without procedure. You invalidated the support contract. You broke the SLA, and you did it on record." His face went red. Not flushed. Red. Like every molecule of blood realized what he'd done before he did. He didn't respond. Nobody did. The rest of the call was a slow-motion corporate collapse. People asking if there were contingencies, if there were offline mirrors, if someone, anyone, had a backup copy, a spreadsheet, a USB, but there wasn't. Because the environment didn't belong to them. It never had. It was licensed, custodied, bound, and the moment they broke the clause, they didn't just lose access. They lost ownership. Now it wasn't about dashboards or deadlines anymore. It was about liability. And every minute that passed without resolution, that was breach territory. Expensive, legal, contractual breach territory. The kind you can't PowerPoint your way out of. By Wednesday morning, the panic wasn't quiet anymore. It was full-blown, echoing through every thread, every inbox, every Slack channel like a 5-alarm fire. The shared portals had updated their message overnight. Every page, roadmaps, sprint boards, policy libraries, even the cafeteria scheduling tool now read the same thing. Access suspended, contact vendor support. In all caps, bold, white background like a digital tombstone. At 9:02 a.m., I got a text from someone in finance, just the screenshot of the portal with that message and 3 question marks. I didn't reply. They didn't have the context. They just knew nothing worked, and Benton wasn't talking. Apparently, Benton had spent most of the Tuesday night trying to spin the story again, this time to internal IT, told them to run the mirror he'd commissioned before Friday. Some local copy he'd rushed a junior dev to build, thinking he'd have a neat little backup if things got complicated. It failed. Checksum mismatch. My scripts had baked in a security layer that flagged unauthorized mirrors and deliberately injected encrypted corruption markers. Harmless, but enough to make any unapproved clone unusable. The moment they booted the mirror, it tripped the checksum blocker, rejected every entry, and shut the node down. So by Wednesday, the realization had fully sunk in. There was no workaround, no shadow copy, no secret key, no backdoor through IT, just a dead stack and a blinking banner that pointed directly to me. I wasn't at headquarters. Hell, I wasn't even in the state. I was in a quiet cafe 3 time zones away, sipping an Americano and finishing a draft proposal for another client who did read their contracts. But even from there, I could feel the wave break. Benton lost it in the morning stand-up. I want him back in here, today. This is sabotage. He said it in front of legal, which was a mistake, because the general counsel, who by now was probably drafting multiple versions of CYA memos, didn't even blink. Just folded her arms and said flatly, "This isn't sabotage. This is contract compliance. You severed the agreement, you triggered the clause, you voided the SLA, and now you're outside the terms of access." That's when the CFO leaned back in his chair, rubbed his face, and muttered just loud enough for someone to catch it. He owned the stack? Not built, not managed, owned. That word rattled down the hallway like a gunshot, because that's when it finally clicked for everyone. I wasn't just some vendor they could strong-arm into compliance. The entire architecture, the cloud environment, the framework, the automated systems, the integrations they relied on, belonged to me through that custodial contract. Not just in function, in title. And now, they didn't even have a way to contact me outside a formal channel, because I'd blocked Benton's emails. I wasn't being petty. I was protecting myself. Once a vendor is improperly terminated, any contact from unauthorized personnel about access can be interpreted as coercion or liability bait, so everything had to go through legal. No backdoors, no phone calls, no desperate coffee invites. It killed him. Word was, he spent most of the day slamming between meeting rooms, yelling about vendor hostage tactics and threatening to escalate to the board. Nobody took him seriously anymore. They were too busy trying to figure out how to relaunch their Q1 timeline without access to their own infrastructure. Spoiler, they couldn't. Because Benton didn't just pull the plug, he pulled the foundation. And now all they had left was the echo of a clause they never bothered to read. By Thursday, the finger-pointing reached biblical proportions. IT blamed legal. Legal blamed Benton. Benton blamed legacy systems. One department head apparently asked if it was possible to reboot the cloud manually, like it was a coffee machine that just needed to be unplugged and plugged back in. Meanwhile, legal was tearing through the archives like their lives depended on it, which, professionally speaking, they kind of did. What they eventually found wasn't buried, wasn't hidden in code or encrypted metadata. It was in a cabinet. A literal manila folder inside a fireproof box labeled Vendor Contracts 2019. Inside it, a signed document. Full signature, dated, notarized. Custodial rights assignment. Barrister Systems LLC duration. 5 years, renewable. Revocable only by board resolution with quorum. Signed by their then CIO, board stamped. Fully binding. The same clause I'd referenced again and again. The same clause Benton never bothered to read. That's when things got worse. Turns out they'd never passed a board vote. Not Friday. Not ever. Which meant the termination wasn't just mishandled. It was invalid. But the clause was written in such a way that an attempted termination, without the quorum, still triggered the support shutdown and put everything in legal limbo. It was like a deadbolt with a one-way lock. Once activated, no one gets in, not even the people who turned the key. That day, Benton's credentials finally expired. Internal systems revoked his access, not because of some heroic gesture. He wasn't fired. He was sidelined, Quietly, legally, access tokens invalidated, VPN revoked, no announcement, no drama, just silence. His assistant resigned the same day. Word was she'd been told to backdoor the transfer paperwork on Friday, to move fast and worry about board votes later. She didn't like being thrown under a bus, and she sure as hell didn't want her name on a violation. Meanwhile, someone found the hard copy I'd left behind. It was in the legal archives, sealed in a white folder, front labeled in all caps. Custody transfer packet. Requires board quorum. Inside, every form, checklist, digital access log, and pass-through approval sheet needed to do this the right way. Highlighted sections, attached timestamp documentation, even a polite sticky note. For formal transition only, please verify board approval before initiating. No one had signed it. It had just sat there for 2 years. They had everything they needed to avoid this. Everything. But they ignored it. Too slow, too bureaucratic, too boring. They wanted fast, flashy, executive action. Instead, they triggered a shutdown with legal teeth. I got an email from the interim replacement Benton never got to name. She was kind. Formal, asked if I'd be willing to consult on a temporary basis. Just until we can reestablish continuity, she wrote, happy to discuss terms. I read it, twice, then closed it. Didn't reply, not out of spite, not to punish anyone, but because there are moments where silence does the explaining, where the contract already answered the question. They thought they could take a shortcut through process and cut corners on something that ran their entire internal spine. But governance doesn't care about convenience. And the clause they didn't read, it cared about everything. The email came in late Friday night, just past 10. CEO herself this time, direct, polished, clearly reviewed by 3 different comms people and 1 very nervous lawyer. She opened with a soft appeal. We respect the incredible work you've done. Then pivoted into strategy. In light of recent events, we'd like to offer a retainer under fresh terms. And finally, the olive branch. Flexible schedule, remote. Just help us transition back to stability. She made it sound like an invitation. What it really was? A quiet white flag. I read the entire thing, twice. Then once more, just to make sure I wasn't imagining the part where the person who'd watched my contract get torched without a vote now wanted me to come clean up the wreckage. No apology, no admission, just, we'd like you back. Like we were friends who'd had a little disagreement over coffee. I didn't get angry. I didn't write a speech. I simply replied, your VP executed the contract. I honored it. That was the entire message, and I meant it. They didn't just sever the agreement. They ignored the protocol I spent years building, through clauses, through escalation pathways, through best practices every department depended on. Their leadership bypassed all of it, and now they wanted me to pretend it didn't matter? I don't do pretend. What I did do was forward the CEO's email to a former mentee of mine, sharp, fast, and already vendor certified under my LLC. She'd just completed her own custodial license training, and she knew how to handle high volatility environments. I handed it off, but not before setting the terms myself. Barrister Systems would remain the vendor of record, but access was no longer plug and play. Every credential had to be tied to biometric sign-ins. Every permissions update required 2-party authentication with time-locked resets. Every dashboard, watermarked. Every shared object, tokenized. Every 30 days, the entire system would roll new encryption keys and invalidate stale sessions. It wasn't a power play. It was a firewall against arrogance. Because I'd learned my lesson too. Give someone like Benton an inch and he'll use it to build a ladder, just tall enough to fall off of and take the whole infrastructure down with him. So from now on, there were no shortcuts. Everything logged. Everything permissioned. Everything slow by design. As for Benton, his modernization roadmap, the one he'd pitched in those first town halls like it was gospel, shelved permanently. The board froze all digital infrastructure changes pending a full audit of vendor governance practices, which meant his pet projects, the flashy dashboards, the AI-light budget forecast tools, gone. They'd wanted disruption. They got it. Now they were begging for stability and paying for it 1 clause at a time. 3 weeks later, the lights came back on. Not with fanfare, not with a town hall or an all-hands revival, but quietly, in the form of working links and restored dashboards that only opened if you had dual auth clearance and a board-approved token. Finance was the first to notice. They logged in one morning expecting another dead end and instead found the Q1 forecast portal alive, time-stamped and version verified. Marketing followed, then ops. Slowly, the system came back online, but not the way they remembered it. Every document was now tagged with a persistent footer. Barrister Systems, LLC, primary custodian valid through 2026, internal override prohibited. Not a watermark you could delete, not a banner you could collapse. It was built in. A contract-born fingerprint at the bottom of every digital surface. Just subtle enough to ignore, just permanent enough to remind them exactly who owned what. They didn't announce my return because I never returned. I wasn't involved in the relaunch, I wasn't added back to the Slack workspace, and I didn't answer the polite follow-up from HR asking if I'd reconsider. My mentee handled the transition. She was calm, thorough, and firm. Every access request went through a vendor control queue. Every script or sync had to be signed off with physical 2FA. Even the CEO had to submit credentials through the token gate. They'd gone from swaggering into root access to waiting 3 business days for read-only approval. That was the trade. They gave up shortcuts, and in exchange, they got stability. There was a panel event 2 months later, some tech leadership symposium about lessons in third-party governance. The CEO was one of the featured speakers. Her slides were polished, full of little phrases like strategic misalignment and accelerated maturity. She called it a necessary lesson in respecting vendor infrastructure. She even smiled when she said it, like the whole thing had been part of some visionary pivot plan. I didn't attend. I watched the live stream from my kitchen, barefoot, coffee in hand while my dog snored under the table. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't feel triumph, just quiet stillness. The kind you get when you build something right, protect it by design, and let other people run face first into the edge they never saw coming. They'd spent weeks shouting, firing off emails, making demands, trying to shout their way into control. But control doesn't shout. Control is a clause. Control is a timestamp. Control is a signature on a page they didn't bother to read, until it became the only thing that mattered.